The doors of Hale Manor slammed shut behind Grace before she even understood what was happening. Her father's voice still echoed in her ears, sharp and cold, cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Get out." Those two words had left his mouth without hesitation, without a single flicker of doubt, as if he had rehearsed them for years. Grace stood on the stone steps, her hands trembling, the cold wind biting through her thin shawl. Behind her, the heavy oak doors remained closed. No one opened them again. No servant came running after her. No voice called her back. She turned once, just once, to look at the house she had grown up in. The tall windows, the ivy climbing the walls, the small garden where she used to play as a child. It all looked the same, yet none of it belonged to her anymore. Lord Edmund Hale had never been a warm man, but Grace never imagined he could do this. Not to his own daughter, not after everything she had already lost. 3 years had passed since her husband, Henry Whitmore, died in a fever that swept through the eastern villages. Grace had barely finished mourning him when the whispers began. "A woman who bears no child is no wife at all," they said. "A woman who bears no child brings shame to her family," they said. And now, standing outside the only home she had ever known, she understood that whispers had turned into something far more dangerous. They had turned into judgment. Lord Hale had summoned her to the study that morning, his face unreadable, his fingers tapping against the polished wood of his desk. Grace had expected another lecture about her appearance, her manners, perhaps another arranged meeting with some distant relative looking for a quiet, obedient wife. She had not expected this. "You bring nothing to this family anymore," he had said, his voice flat and businesslike, as though he were discussing the sale of livestock rather than the fate of his own child. "No husband, no child, no title worth mentioning. You are a burden I can no longer carry." Grace had tried to speak, to remind him that she was still his daughter, that blood did not simply disappear because fortune had turned unkind. But he had raised his hand, silencing her before she could finish. "The decision is made," he said. "You will leave this house by morning. Take nothing that belongs to this family. You are no longer welcome here." And that had been the end of it. No tears from him, no hesitation, just silence, and then the door closing behind her, like the final page of a story she had never agreed to write. Now, standing outside in the cold, Grace realized she had nowhere to go. Her small bag held only a few pieces of clothing, a worn blanket, and a single silver locket that had belonged to her mother, tucked deep inside her sleeve where no one could take it from her. Everything else, the modest dowry, the small collection of books she had loved as a child, even the letters Henry had once written to her, all of it remained locked behind those doors, out of her reach forever. A soft voice called her name from behind the garden wall. Grace turned quickly, startled, only to see Lucy hurrying toward her, breathless, her apron still dusted with flour from the kitchen. "I heard what happened," Lucy said, her eyes wide with worry. "I could not believe it. Your own father, Grace. How could he do such a thing?" Grace tried to smile, though the effort felt hollow. "It seems I no longer have a place here, Lucy. Perhaps it is better this way. At least now there is no pretending." Lucy shook her head firmly. "I am coming with you. I have already decided. You should not walk this road alone." Grace opened her mouth to protest, to tell Lucy that she could not ask her to give up her position, her wages, her safety, all for the sake of loyalty to a woman who had nothing left to offer in return. But Lucy would not hear it. She had already gathered her own small bag, tied with a piece of twine, sitting by the garden gate, as though she had been preparing for this moment long before it arrived. "You did not ask me," Lucy said simply. "I chose this myself. Now let us go, before anyone changes their mind about letting either of us leave in peace." Together, the two women walked down the long gravel path, leading away from Hale Manor, the estate growing smaller behind them with every step. Grace did not look back again. She could not bear to see the house that had once been her home, now standing as nothing more than a cold reminder of how quickly love could be replaced by convenience, and family could be measured only by usefulness. The road ahead was long, stretching through fields and forests, toward villages Grace had never visited. She had heard of a small settlement near the eastern border, called Millbrook, a place known for its quiet farms and modest markets, far from the reach of noble families and their judgments. It seemed as good a destination as any, a place where no one would know her name, where the word Barren would mean nothing more than a word. They walked for most of the day, resting only briefly beneath the shade of old oak trees, sharing what little bread Lucy had managed to bring from the kitchen before leaving. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep violet, they finally saw the rooftops of Millbrook in the distance, smoke rising gently from chimneys, the sound of distant laughter, and clattering carts drifting on the evening breeze. Grace felt something unfamiliar stir inside her chest as they approached the village. It was not quite hope, not yet, but it was something close to it, a quiet whisper of possibility, buried beneath months of grief and humiliation. They found a small inn at the edge of the village, its wooden sign creaking softly in the wind. The innkeeper, an older woman with kind eyes and rough hands from years of hard work, took one look at the two exhausted travelers and did not ask many questions. She simply offered them a room in exchange for a few days of work in the kitchen, an arrangement Grace accepted without hesitation. That night, lying on a thin mattress in a room far smaller than anything she had ever known, Grace stared up at the wooden ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the village settling into sleep. Lucy had already drifted off beside her, exhausted from the long journey, but Grace found herself unable to close her eyes. She thought of her father's cold expression, the way he had dismissed her without a hint of hesitation. She thought of Henry, the husband she had loved and lost, and the cruel rumors that followed his death like a shadow she could never outrun. She thought of the silver locket still tucked safely against her skin, the only piece of her old life she had managed to keep. Grace pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the small weight of the locket beneath her fingers, and made herself a quiet promise. She would not let this be the end of her story. She would not let a single cruel judgment define the rest of her life. Whatever waited for her in Millbrook, whatever challenges the road ahead might bring, she would face them with the same quiet strength that had carried her this far. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling through the trees surrounding the village. Somewhere beyond those trees, far past the borders of Millbrook, a different kind of storm was gathering, one that Grace could not yet see coming. But for now, in the quiet darkness of a small inn far from everything she had once known, she allowed herself to finally rest. The days that followed brought a strange new rhythm to Grace's life, one built not on titles or expectations, but on simple survival. She woke before dawn each morning, helping the innkeeper prepare bread and stew for the early travelers who passed through Millbrook on their way to the larger towns beyond the eastern hills. Her hands, once soft and unused to labor, grew rough within weeks, calloused from scrubbing pots and carrying heavy baskets of vegetables from the market square. Lucy worked alongside her without complaint, the two women forming a quiet partnership built on shared hardship and unspoken loyalty. In the evenings, when their work was finally finished, they would sit together near the small fireplace in their shared room, speaking softly about the lives they had left behind, careful never to let their voices carry too far beyond the thin walls. Grace quickly learned that Millbrook was a village of quiet secrets and careful silence. No one asked too many questions about where a traveler had come from, or why they had chosen to settle so far from the nearest city. It was a place built by those who wished to disappear, farmers and craftsmen who valued privacy above curiosity, and Grace found unexpected comfort in that unspoken understanding. Still, the shadow of her past followed her, even in this distant corner of the kingdom. Late one afternoon, while helping at the market stall, Grace overheard two women speaking in hushed voices near the bread cart, unaware that she stood close enough to hear every word. "They say a widow arrived not long ago," one woman whispered. "Cast out by her own father, if the rumors are true. Barren, they call her. No wonder no man would keep her." Grace felt her cheeks burn, though she said nothing, keeping her eyes fixed on the loaves of bread stacked neatly before her. She had hoped that distance alone might be enough to escape such cruelty, but she was beginning to understand a harder truth. Judgment did not need proximity to survive. It traveled just as easily through whispered rumors as it did through direct accusation. That evening, as she and Lucy walked back toward the inn, Grace finally spoke the doubt that had been building inside her for days. "Perhaps there is no place far enough, Lucy," she said quietly. "Perhaps the world has already decided who I am, no matter where I go." Lucy stopped walking, turning to face her with a firm and steady expression. "The world decided nothing, Grace. Cruel people spoke cruel words, and other cruel people repeated them. That is not truth. That is simply noise. You are the only one who decides who you are." Grace wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to those words with the same certainty Lucy seemed to carry. But months of quiet humiliation had worn deep grooves into her confidence, grooves that would not disappear overnight simply because a loyal friend offered comforting words. Despite her doubts, Grace pushed forward, refusing to let herself sink into despair. She began taking on additional work at the village square, mending clothes for local families who could not afford tailors from the larger towns. Her skill with a needle, something she had learned as a young girl under her mother's patient guidance, quickly earned her a small but steady reputation among the villagers. It was during one such afternoon, while sitting near the edge of the market square, repairing a torn coat for an elderly farmer, that Grace first witnessed the incident that would change the course of her life forever, though she had no way of knowing it at the time. A young boy, no older than 7 or 8, had wandered too close to a merchant's cart loaded with fine silks and imported goods clearly meant for wealthier buyers passing through the village. The merchant, a sharp-tongued man with an inflated sense of his own importance, grabbed the boy roughly by the arm, accusing him loudly of attempting to steal from his cart. "I saw nothing of the sort," the boy cried, tears welling in his frightened eyes. "I was only looking. I never touched anything." The merchant's grip tightened, his voice rising with anger, drawing the attention of nearby villagers who watched with quiet unease but hesitated to intervene, unwilling to risk conflict with a man clearly connected to wealthier trade routes. Grace, however, felt something inside her stir, a flicker of the same quiet defiance that had once made her father so uncomfortable in her younger years. She set down her needle and thread, rising to her feet without a second thought, and walked directly toward the merchant's cart. "Release him," she said, her voice calm but firm, carrying just enough authority to draw the attention of everyone nearby. "He is a child, and children are curious by nature. If you have proof of wrongdoing, present it. Otherwise, remove your hand from his arm immediately." The merchant turned toward her, clearly startled by the boldness of a simple village woman, challenging him so directly. "Who do you think you are, addressing me in such a manner?" he demanded, his tone dripping with condescension. "I am someone with eyes," Grace replied evenly, refusing to back down beneath his glare. "And my eyes tell me a grown man is frightening a child over goods that remain untouched on his cart. Release him now, or I will ensure every merchant passing through this village hears exactly how you treat frightened children who wander too close to your wares." Something in her steady tone, perhaps the quiet confidence she had not realized she still carried within her, seemed to unsettle the merchant more than any threat of violence could have. After a long, tense moment, he released the boy's arm with a huff of irritation, muttering something under his breath, before turning back to his cart, clearly unwilling to continue the confrontation in front of the gathering crowd. The boy scrambled away quickly, disappearing into the safety of the surrounding market stalls, while Grace returned to her seat near the tailor's stand, her heart still pounding from the sudden burst of courage she had summoned, without fully thinking it through. She did not notice the tall stranger standing near the edge of the square, half hidden beneath the shadow of a large oak tree, watching the entire exchange with quiet, careful interest. Dressed simply, without the fine embroidery or polished boots typically worn by nobility, he blended easily into the crowd of ordinary travelers passing through Millbrook that afternoon. But his eyes remained fixed on Grace long after the confrontation ended, studying her with an expression that mixed curiosity, admiration, and something else entirely, something he himself could not quite name. He had come to Millbrook for entirely different reasons, following quiet reports of unrest along the kingdom's eastern border, never expecting to witness something as small yet as striking as a simple village woman defending a frightened child with nothing but calm words and unshaken resolve. The stranger lingered near the square for a while longer, watching as Grace returned to her mending work as though nothing unusual had happened at all, seemingly unaware of the impression she had left behind. He said nothing, made no attempt to approach her, and eventually turned to continue his journey deeper into the village, his mind still lingering on the quiet strength he had just witnessed. Grace, of course, had no idea that the man watching her from beneath the oak tree was King Alden himself, ruler of the entire kingdom, traveling in disguise, far from the comforts of his palace. She could not have imagined that a single moment of quiet defiance in a small village market would soon set into motion events far beyond anything she could have predicted. That evening, as she and Lucy shared a simple meal of bread and vegetable stew back at the inn, Grace mentioned the incident only briefly, downplaying her own involvement as nothing more than a small act of common decency. "A merchant frightened a young boy today," she said between bites, "and I simply asked him to stop. Nothing more than that." Lucy raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing there was more to the story than Grace was willing to admit, but she chose not to press the matter further, allowing her friend the space to keep her own quiet victories to herself if she wished. Neither woman noticed the tall stranger passing by the inn's window later that night, pausing briefly outside before continuing on his way, his thoughts still occupied by the image of a widow with tired eyes and an unshaken spine, standing tall against a man who believed his wealth entitled him to cruelty. Grace fell asleep that night with a small, unfamiliar sense of pride resting quietly in her chest, unaware that her simple act of courage in a quiet village square had already caught the attention of someone whose presence would soon change the entire course of her life, in ways she could never have imagined possible. 3 days passed before Grace saw the tall stranger again, though this time she recognized him immediately, standing near the same oak tree at the edge of the market square, watching the morning crowd with quiet, careful eyes. He wore the same simple traveling clothes as before, nothing that suggested wealth or status, yet something about the way he carried himself set him apart from the ordinary farmers and merchants moving around him. She thought little of it at first, assuming he was simply another traveler passing through Millbrook on his way to somewhere else. But when their eyes met briefly across the square, he offered a small nod of acknowledgement, as though they were already familiar with one another, and something about the gesture left Grace feeling strangely unsettled for the rest of the day. It was 2 mornings later, while Grace sat near the edge of the village well, mending a torn sleeve for one of the local farmers, that the stranger finally approached her directly. "Forgive me for intruding," he said, his voice deep and measured, carrying none of the arrogance she had grown used to hearing from wealthier travelers. "I could not help but notice your skill with a needle. Would you happen to have time to repair a torn coat for a weary traveler?" Grace glanced up at him, studying his face for a moment before answering. He seemed younger than she had first assumed, his features sharp and serious, though there was a quiet warmth hiding just beneath the surface of his expression. "I have time," she said simply, gesturing toward the empty seat beside her. "Sit, and I will see what can be done." He introduced himself only as Alden, offering no additional title or explanation, and Grace did not think to question it further. Travelers passing through Millbrook rarely offered much detail about their lives, and she had long since learned not to pry into matters that were not her own. As she worked on the torn seam of his coat, Alden spoke easily, asking simple questions about her life in the village, careful never to push too deeply into matters she seemed unwilling to discuss. Grace found herself answering more openly than she expected, sharing small details about her work at the inn, her friendship with Lucy, and the quiet peace she had found in Millbrook after a difficult year. "I saw what you did for that boy near the merchant's cart," Alden said eventually, his tone gentle but curious. It took courage to challenge a man like that so directly, especially as a woman alone, in an unfamiliar village. Grace paused her stitching for a moment, considering his words carefully before responding. "Courage, or perhaps simply a lack of patience for cruelty," she said. "I have seen enough unkindness in my life to recognize it quickly, and I no longer have the patience to stay silent when I see it directed at someone weaker than myself." Something shifted in Alden's expression at her words, a flicker of understanding that seemed to run deeper than simple conversation. He said nothing further on the matter, allowing the silence between them to settle comfortably as Grace finished her work on his coat. From that day forward, Alden returned to the village regularly, always finding some small reason to seek Grace out during her work at the market or the tailor's stand. Sometimes he brought news from distant towns, sharing stories of places Grace had never visited. Other times he simply sat nearby, watching quietly as she worked, offering conversation only when she seemed willing to engage. Lucy noticed the pattern quickly, though she said nothing directly, choosing instead to watch her friend with quiet curiosity as the weeks passed. Grace herself barely noticed how much she had begun to look forward to Alden's visits, how the quiet ache of loneliness that had followed her since leaving Hale Manor seemed to soften slightly whenever he appeared at the edge of the square. One afternoon, as the two of them sat together near the riverbank just beyond the village boundary, Alden asked a question that caught Grace entirely off guard. "Why did you leave your previous home?" he asked quietly, watching the water drift past. "You speak carefully whenever the subject arises, as though there is more to the story than you allow yourself to share." Grace hesitated for a long moment, staring out at the slow-moving river, wondering how much of the truth she was willing to reveal to a man she barely knew. Eventually, she decided that honesty, however painful, felt easier than continuing to carry the weight of her secret alone. "My husband died 3 years ago," she began quietly. "After his death, rumors began to spread that I was unable to bear children, that our marriage had produced no heir, because some fault existed within me, rather than circumstance or simple misfortune. My father grew tired of the shame those rumors brought upon our family name. Eventually, he decided I was no longer worth keeping." Alden remained silent for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly as he listened to her words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet intensity that surprised her. "A father is meant to protect his child, not discard her over the cruel gossip of strangers," he said firmly. "Whatever judgment others placed upon you, it was never a reflection of your worth, only a reflection of their own weakness, in believing empty rumors over loyalty to their own blood." Grace felt something tighten in her chest at his words, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her that she had not felt in years. No one had spoken to her with such conviction since Henry's passing, and certainly no one had ever defended her so fiercely against judgments she had long since accepted as unavoidable truth. "You speak as though you understand such things personally," she said softly, studying his expression carefully. Alden's jaw tightened further, his eyes drifting toward the horizon, as though gathering the courage to share something he rarely spoke of. "I know what it feels like to be doubted by those who should have supported you without question," he admitted quietly. "I know what it feels like to have your worth measured by circumstances entirely beyond your control, judged before anyone bothered to understand the truth." Grace wanted to ask more, to understand exactly what burdens this quiet, thoughtful stranger carried beneath his calm exterior. But something in his expression told her the subject had reached its limit for the day. Instead, she simply nodded, allowing the comfortable silence to settle between them once again, as they continued watching the river drift slowly past. As the weeks turned into a full season, Grace found herself changing in ways she had not expected. The quiet shame that had followed her since leaving Hale Manor began to soften, replaced slowly by a growing sense of her own worth, nurtured carefully through Alden's steady presence and unwavering respect. She laughed more easily during their conversations, spoke more freely about her hopes for the future, and even Lucy noticed the subtle shift in her friend's demeanor with quiet relief. Yet despite the growing warmth between them, Grace remained careful never to ask too many questions about Alden's own life beyond the village. She sensed a hidden weight behind his calm exterior, a burden he carried quietly, and she respected his privacy in the same way he had always respected hers. Little did she know, the quiet peace they had built together in Millbrook was approaching its final days, as forces far beyond the village borders were beginning to stir. Forces that would soon reveal the true identity of the man she had grown to trust, in ways neither of them could have fully anticipated. The weeks that followed brought a quiet rhythm neither Grace nor Alden had expected to find, tucked away in a small village far from the world either of them had once known. Grace continued her work at the inn and the tailor's stand, while Alden appeared with growing regularity, sometimes staying for hours, other times only long enough to share a brief conversation, before disappearing again, toward whatever business called him away. Grace never asked where he went during his absences, and Alden never offered a full explanation, though she began to notice small details that seemed inconsistent with the simple traveler he claimed to be. His boots, though plain, were crafted from finer leather than any traveling merchant could afford. His manner of speech, though careful, carried an authority that seemed too natural to belong to a common wanderer. Once, she noticed a faint mark on his wrist, quickly hidden beneath his sleeve, that resembled an emblem she could not quite place. She said nothing of these observations, choosing instead to trust the quiet comfort she had found in his company, rather than question the mystery surrounding him. Whatever secrets Alden carried, Grace had come to believe they belonged to him alone, and she had no right to demand answers he was not yet ready to give. One evening, as autumn winds began sweeping through Millbrook, carrying the scent of falling leaves and distant rain, Alden arrived at the village later than usual, his expression heavier than Grace had seen before. She noticed immediately that something weighed on him, though he tried to mask it behind his usual calm demeanor. "You seem troubled tonight," she said gently, setting aside the mending she had been working on. "Has something happened?" Alden hesitated for a long moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. There are difficulties within my responsibilities that grow harder to manage each day, he admitted quietly. Decisions that affect many people, expectations placed upon me since before I was old enough to understand their full weight. Sometimes it becomes difficult to remember who I am beneath all of it. Grace studied him carefully, recognizing something familiar in his words, a burden not unlike the one she herself had carried for years beneath the judgment of others. Perhaps, she said softly, the person you are beneath all of it is simply someone trying his best, despite circumstances he never fully chose for himself. That alone deserves more patience than most people offer themselves. Alden turned to look at her then, something shifting behind his eyes that Grace could not quite name. You speak with a wisdom that suggests you have faced similar burdens yourself, he said quietly. Grace allowed a small, tired smile to cross her face. I have spent most of my life being told who I was by other people, she admitted. My father decided I was a burden. Rumors decided I was broken. It has taken me a long time to begin deciding for myself who I truly am, separate from everything others have claimed about me. Something in her words seemed to settle deeply within Alden, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in comfortable silence as the evening settled around them. Eventually, Alden reached out, gently taking her hand in his, a gesture that surprised them both with its quiet intimacy. Whoever decided you were broken, he said softly, was profoundly mistaken. I have rarely met anyone as whole, as strong, or as clear in their own sense of right and wrong as you, Grace. Do not let old judgments continue shaping how you see yourself. Grace felt her chest tighten with emotion, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her at his words. She had spent so long believing herself unworthy of kindness, convinced that her value had been permanently diminished by circumstances beyond her control. Hearing Alden speak so plainly, so sincerely, began to slowly dismantle walls she had built around her heart since Henry's passing. As the evening deepened, Alden remained at her side longer than usual, and for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Grace allowed herself to imagine a future that included something more than simple survival. She did not yet understand who Alden truly was, or what forces might eventually pull him away from the quiet life they had built together within the village borders, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. Unbeknownst to either of them, far beyond the village of Millbrook, within the walls of the royal palace, growing unrest had begun to stir among the king's advisors. Reports had reached the capital of King Alden's frequent, unexplained absences, journeys taken without royal escort, without proper announcement, and without any clear explanation offered to the council responsible for the kingdom's daily governance. Sir Edwin, the king's most trusted advisor, had grown increasingly concerned over recent weeks, watching as Alden departed the palace with growing frequency, always vague about his destination, always returning with a strange, quiet distance that Edwin could not quite understand. Your Majesty, Edwin said one evening, standing before Alden's private chambers with visible unease. The council grows restless. Rumors have begun circulating regarding your frequent absences. Some fear instability at the borders. Others fear something far more troubling, that you may be neglecting your duties for reasons unknown to this council. Alden regarded his advisor carefully, choosing his words with measured caution. My duties remain my priority, Edwin, he said firmly. What I do during my private hours is a matter I intend to keep separate from the concerns of this council, at least for the time being. Edwin studied the king's expression carefully, sensing there was far more beneath the surface than Alden was willing to reveal. Forgive my boldness, Your Majesty, he said cautiously, but should this matter eventually affect the stability of the crown, this council will require answers you may no longer be able to withhold. Alden said nothing in response, though the weight of Edwin's words lingered long after his advisor departed. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the quiet peace he had discovered in Millbrook and the growing bond he had formed with Grace existed within a fragile bubble that could not remain hidden from the world forever. Yet despite the mounting pressure from his council, despite the quiet warnings from Edwin regarding the responsibilities that awaited him within the palace walls, Alden found himself unwilling to abandon the connection he had built with Grace. For the first time since assuming the throne years earlier, following a period of uncertainty when many had doubted his right to rule after his father's sudden passing, Alden had found someone who valued him, not for his title, not for the power he commanded, but simply for the man he was beneath all of it. He knew, deep within himself, that the truth of his identity could not remain hidden from Grace forever. Yet each time he considered revealing himself fully, fear held him back, a quiet worry that the revelation might shatter the fragile trust they had built together, transforming their quiet, honest connection into something complicated by politics, expectation, and the weight of the crown itself. For now, he allowed himself simply to enjoy the quiet evenings spent at Grace's side, treasuring each stolen moment away from the palace, unaware that time was quickly running short, and that the truth he feared revealing would soon be discovered in the most unexpected way possible. The morning the truth finally revealed itself began like any other in Millbrook, the market square filling with the usual sounds of carts rolling over cobblestones and merchants calling out their morning prices. Grace had just finished helping the innkeeper prepare the day's bread, when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention toward the village entrance. She had never seen so many riders enter Millbrook at once, at least a dozen men dressed in fine armor, their horses bearing polished saddles far too elegant for simple travelers passing through a quiet farming village. At the front of the group rode a stern-faced man, whose bearing immediately marked him as someone of significant authority, his eyes scanning the village with sharp, purposeful focus. Villagers stopped their work, gathering cautiously near the edges of the square, whispering among themselves as the riders came to a halt near the central well. Grace felt a strange unease settle over her, though she could not immediately understand why the sight of armored guards should concern her so deeply. "We seek information regarding a traveler known simply as Alden," the lead rider announced, his voice carrying easily across the square. "He has been seen frequenting this village in recent months. Anyone with knowledge of his whereabouts should come forward immediately." Grace felt her heart drop as understanding began to settle over her, cold and sudden, like ice spreading through her veins. She glanced toward Lucy, who stood beside her with an equally stunned expression, both women realizing simultaneously that the quiet stranger they had grown to know so well was not simply a traveler passing through their lives. An elderly farmer nearby, unaware of the growing tension building within Grace, spoke up innocently, gesturing toward the tailor's stand where Grace often worked. "That woman there has spoken with him often," he said, pointing directly toward her without malice, simply offering the information he believed might be helpful. The lead rider's gaze shifted immediately toward Grace, his expression sharpening with sudden interest. Grace felt every eye in the market square turn toward her, and for a long, terrifying moment, she could not find the words to respond. "You know the man in question?" the rider asked, dismounting his horse and approaching her directly. "Speak plainly. Where might we find him?" Grace's mind raced, struggling to piece together the sudden realization crashing over her. The fine leather of his boots, the authority hidden beneath his calm demeanor, the faint emblem she had once glimpsed upon his wrist before he quickly concealed it. Everything suddenly made painful, undeniable sense. "I know only a traveler by that name," she managed to say, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt to remain composed. "I was unaware he carried any significance beyond simple conversation." The rider studied her carefully, clearly unconvinced by her hesitant response, though he offered no further pressure, instead turning to address the gathered villagers with a firm, commanding tone. "Should anyone see this man again, you are to send word to the palace immediately. His safety remains a matter of the highest priority for the kingdom." The word palace struck Grace like a physical blow, confirming the fear that had already begun forming within her mind. The quiet, thoughtful stranger she had grown to trust, the man whose gentle words had slowly begun healing wounds she believed permanent, was none other than King Alden himself, ruler of the very kingdom that had once judged her unworthy, simply for failing to produce an heir. As the riders eventually departed, continuing their search through the surrounding countryside, Grace remained frozen near the tailor's stand, her thoughts spinning in painful, chaotic circles. Lucy approached her carefully, placing a gentle hand upon her shoulder. "Grace," she said softly, "are you well? You look as though you have seen a ghost." Grace shook her head slowly, struggling to process the magnitude of what she had just learned. "He is the king, Lucy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "All this time, I believed I was speaking with a simple traveler, sharing my most painful truths with someone I thought understood hardship the way I did. Yet he is the very ruler of the kingdom that discarded me without a second thought." Lucy's expression softened with quiet sympathy, though she said nothing immediately, allowing Grace the space to process the overwhelming revelation. After a long moment, Grace spoke again, her voice hardening with sudden resolve. "I cannot remain here," she said firmly. "If the king himself has taken notice of our friendship, it will not be long before others learn of it as well. A widow cast out for barrenness, spending her days in conversation with the king, will only invite further scandal, further judgment, further pain. I must leave before matters grow worse." Despite Lucy's gentle attempts to convince her otherwise, urging her to wait, to speak with Alden directly before making any hasty decisions, Grace's mind had already been made. By nightfall, she had gathered what little belongings she owned, determined to leave Millbrook before Alden returned again, believing firmly that a king's attention could only bring further ruin to a life already shattered by cruel judgment. She left a brief note with the innkeeper, thanking her for her kindness, offering no explanation beyond a simple statement that circumstances required her departure. Lucy, torn between loyalty to her friend and concern over the hasty decision being made, ultimately chose to remain behind briefly, promising to follow shortly after ensuring their room and remaining belongings were properly settled. Grace set out alone into the early evening darkness, following the same road that had once led her toward Millbrook months earlier, though now walking in the opposite direction, away from the quiet peace she had only just begun to build. Tears streamed silently down her face as she walked, grief and confusion tangled together within her chest. She had allowed herself for the first time in years to hope for something more than mere survival. She had allowed herself to believe that perhaps happiness remained possible, despite everything she had endured. Yet now, faced with the overwhelming truth of who Alden truly was, that fragile hope crumbled beneath the weight of old fears, old judgments, and the certainty that a king's attention could only end in further heartbreak for a woman the world had already deemed unworthy. As darkness settled fully over the countryside, Grace continued walking, unaware that word of her sudden departure had already reached Alden, who had returned to Millbrook that very evening, only to discover the woman he had grown to care for deeply had vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but a quiet, empty room, and a heart heavy with fear she believed impossible to overcome. Alden stood in the small, empty room at the inn, staring at the note Grace had left behind, his chest tightening with a sharp, unfamiliar panic. He had feared this moment for weeks, the possibility that his identity might eventually be discovered before he found the right way to reveal it himself. Yet the reality of it striking so suddenly left him unprepared for the wave of emotion crashing through him. Lucy, who had remained behind at the inn, approached him cautiously, uncertain how to address the king directly, though the urgency of the situation quickly overcame her hesitation. "She left barely an hour ago," Lucy said quietly, wringing her hands nervously. "She believes her connection to you will only bring further ruin upon herself. She fears the judgment that will follow, if others learn a cast-out widow has grown close to the king." Alden's jaw tightened, frustration and fear mixing together within him. "She believes wrongly," he said firmly. "I must find her before she travels too far. Which direction did she take?" Lucy pointed toward the road leading west, back toward the direction Grace had originally come from months earlier, and Alden wasted no further time, immediately calling for his horse, ignoring the guards who had only just arrived searching for him. "Your Majesty," one of the guards said, startled by his sudden urgency. "We must discuss the matter of your safety, the council's concerns regarding your absence." "There is no time for council matters tonight," Alden interrupted firmly, mounting his horse with practiced ease. "Something far more important requires my immediate attention. Follow if you must, but I will not delay another moment." He rode swiftly into the darkening countryside, his mind consumed entirely by thoughts of Grace, alone and frightened, walking through unfamiliar roads believing herself unworthy of the very happiness she had only just begun to embrace. He refused to allow old fears and cruel judgments to steal away something he had come to treasure so deeply. Grace, meanwhile, continued walking along the quiet road, her thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. Part of her longed to turn back, to seek out Alden, and demand a true explanation for everything he had concealed from her. Yet another part of her, the part shaped by years of rejection and quiet humiliation, insisted that distance remained her only true protection against further heartbreak. She had nearly reached a small crossroads marking the boundary between Millbrook's surrounding farmland and the wider forest beyond, when the sound of approaching hooves echoed through the quiet evening air behind her. Startled, she turned quickly, her heart pounding as she recognized the familiar silhouette approaching swiftly through the darkness. Alden dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, closing the distance between them with quick, determined strides. Grace took an instinctive step backward, uncertain how to face him now that the truth of his identity had been revealed so completely. "You should not have come after me," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt to remain composed. "I understand now who you truly are, and I understand the impossible position my presence would create for a king. It is better this way, Alden. Better for both of us." "Better for whom?" he asked firmly, stopping just before her, his eyes searching hers with an intensity she had never seen from him before. "Because from where I stand, nothing about losing you feels better in any sense whatsoever." Grace shook her head, tears beginning to blur her vision. "You are the king," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "A king cannot simply align himself with a widow cast out by her own family, discarded for failing to provide an heir. My presence beside you would invite nothing but scandal, judgment, and further shame, not only upon myself, but upon your own crown as well." Alden reached forward gently, taking her hands in his despite her hesitation. "Listen to me carefully, Grace," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by those who judged my worth, based on circumstances entirely beyond my control. When my father passed unexpectedly, many within this kingdom doubted my ability to rule, believing me too young, too inexperienced, too unprepared to carry the weight of the crown. I understand, perhaps better than anyone, what it feels like to be measured by unfair judgment, rather than true character." He paused, his grip tightening gently around her hands. "From the very first moment I witnessed you defending that frightened child in the market square, I recognized something within you that I had not encountered in years. A strength forged not despite hardship, but through it. Your worth was never defined by your ability to bear children, nor by the cruel whispers of those too small-minded to understand true resilience. Your worth lies in exactly who you are, the same woman who showed me more genuine kindness and understanding than most within my own palace walls." Grace felt her resolve beginning to crumble beneath the weight of his words, tears now falling freely down her cheeks, as months of buried pain finally began to surface. "But your council," she whispered, "your advisors, the entire kingdom, they will never accept a queen who could not provide an heir for her own husband, let alone one already scarred by public shame." Alden reached up gently, brushing a tear from her cheek with careful tenderness. "Let me worry about the council," he said firmly. "Let me worry about the kingdom's expectations. What I ask of you now is simply this. Do not walk away from something real, something honest, out of fear for judgments that have not yet even been spoken. Give me the chance to prove that your place beside me is exactly where you belong." For a long moment, Grace said nothing, standing quietly beneath the darkening sky as she weighed years of accumulated fear against the quiet conviction burning steadily within Alden's eyes. Finally, she allowed herself a small, trembling breath, nodding slowly as she made her decision. "I am frightened," she admitted softly, "but I no longer wish to run from something that might bring genuine happiness, simply because I fear what others might say." Alden pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close, as relief washed over him. "Then let us face whatever comes together," he said quietly against her hair. "Whatever challenges await us, I promise you will never face them alone again." As the two of them stood together beneath the darkening sky, neither could yet fully imagine the storm of political scrutiny, cruel rumors, and determined opposition that awaited them back within the capital. Yet for the first time in longer than either could remember, both Grace and Alden felt a quiet, unshakable certainty that whatever difficulties lay ahead, they would face them together, side by side. The journey back to the capital took nearly 3 full days, Grace riding beside Alden, with Lucy following closely behind, in a modest carriage, arranged quickly by the royal guards, who had eventually caught up with their king along the forest road. Grace had never seen the capital before, and as the towering palace walls finally came into view on the horizon, she felt a fresh wave of anxiety settle over her, mixing uncomfortably with the fragile hope she had only just allowed herself to embrace. The palace itself proved more overwhelming than anything Grace could have imagined, its towering spires and polished stone corridors a stark contrast to the simple wooden inn she had called home for the past several months. Servants moved quickly through the halls, whispering among themselves as they caught sight of the widow arriving alongside their king, clearly unaccustomed to seeing him return from his private travels with a guest of such humble origin. Sir Edwin met them near the palace entrance, his expression carefully neutral, though Grace could sense the concern hidden just beneath his composed exterior. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, bowing slightly before glancing toward Grace with poorly concealed curiosity. "The council has grown increasingly anxious during your absence. May I ask who accompanies you?" "This is Grace," Alden said firmly, leaving no room for misunderstanding in his tone. "She will remain here under my protection, and I expect her to be treated with the same respect afforded to any guest within these walls." Edwin's eyes widened slightly, though he said nothing further, simply nodding, before escorting them deeper into the palace. Grace could feel the weight of curious stares following her through every corridor, whispered questions passing between servants, who clearly recognized that something significant had shifted within the palace's usual routine. Within days, word of Grace's presence spread quickly throughout the capital, and just as she had feared, the rumors surrounding her past began circulating with renewed cruelty. Nobles who had never met her whispered about the Barren widow the king had brought back from a distant village, questioning his judgment, questioning her intentions, and questioning whether such a woman could ever truly belong within the walls of a royal palace. Among the most vocal of her critics was Lord Grant, a wealthy nobleman with significant influence over several members of the king's council. Grant had long harbored ambitions of aligning his own daughter with the king, hoping to secure his family's position through a favorable marriage, and Grace's sudden arrival threatened those carefully laid plans entirely. "This is an outrage," Grant declared during a private council meeting shortly after Grace's arrival, his voice carrying sharp disapproval. "Our king has brought a woman of questionable reputation into these walls, a widow discarded by her own family for failing to fulfill her most basic duty as a wife. What message does this send to the kingdom regarding the standards expected of our future queen?" Several council members murmured in agreement, though Sir Edwin, despite his own initial reservations, found himself surprisingly cautious about joining the growing chorus of disapproval. He had watched Alden's demeanor shift noticeably since returning with Grace, a quiet confidence and calm settling over the king that Edwin had not witnessed in years. "Perhaps," Edwin said carefully, "we should allow the king the opportunity to explain his reasoning before condemning a woman none of us have properly met. Judgment based purely on rumor has led this council astray before." Grant scoffed openly at the suggestion, clearly unwilling to abandon his opposition so easily. "Rumor or not," he continued firmly, "the fact remains that this woman carries a reputation that could severely damage the crown's standing among our allies. We cannot simply ignore such concerns for the sake of the king's personal preferences." Unbeknownst to Grace, Grant had already begun quietly working behind the scenes, spreading additional rumors throughout the capital, exaggerating details of her past, and encouraging other nobles to voice their concerns publicly, in hopes of pressuring Alden into abandoning his growing attachment to her, before matters progressed any further. Grace, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the political maneuvering occurring around her, though she could not ignore the cold stares and whispered conversations that followed her through the palace corridors each day. She spent much of her time within the private quarters Alden had arranged for her, accompanied often by Lucy, who had finally arrived at the capital several days after their initial departure from Millbrook. "They truly do not wish for me to be here," Grace admitted quietly one evening, sitting beside Lucy near the window of her private chambers, watching the palace gardens below. "I can feel it in every glance, every whispered conversation that stops the moment I enter a room." Lucy reached over, squeezing her friend's hand gently in reassurance. "Give them time, Grace," she said softly. "They do not yet know you as I do. Once they see the same strength and kindness I have witnessed these past months, their judgment will surely soften." Grace wanted desperately to believe her friend's words, yet the constant undercurrent of hostility surrounding her within the palace walls made such optimism difficult to maintain. She noticed how certain servants avoided eye contact entirely, how nobles passing through the corridors would lower their voices the moment she approached, clearly discussing matters they preferred she remain ignorant of. Alden, for his part, remained steadfast in his support, visiting her chambers each evening, despite the mounting pressure from his council, reassuring her repeatedly that whatever opposition arose would eventually fade once the truth of her character became undeniable to those around them. "Do not let their whispers convince you of anything less than your true worth," he told her one evening, holding her hands gently as they sat together near the fireplace. I have faced doubt and judgment before, and I have learned that those who truly matter will see beyond rumor to recognize genuine character. Grant and his allies fear losing influence, nothing more. Their opposition has little to do with who you truly are. Despite his reassurances, Grace could sense a growing storm building within the palace walls, one that threatened to challenge everything she and Alden had built together during their quiet months in Millbrook. She did not yet know how far Lord Grant intended to take his opposition, nor did she fully understand the depth of cruelty still awaiting her within the political games of the royal court. Yet as she looked toward Alden, watching the quiet determination reflected clearly in his expression, Grace found herself drawing strength from his unwavering support, preparing herself as best she could for whatever challenges still lay ahead within the walls of the capital she now called home. Word of Grace's presence within the royal palace eventually reached Hale Manor, carried swiftly through the same network of gossip and rumor that had once condemned her as a burden unworthy of her father's protection. Lord Edmund Hale received the news with a mixture of disbelief and calculated opportunity, quickly recognizing that his discarded daughter's unexpected rise within the royal court might yet be turned to his own advantage. Within days, Hale arrived at the capital himself, requesting an audience with the King's Council, under the pretense of protecting his family's honor. Lord Grant, delighted by this unexpected development, wasted no time arranging a public gathering within the Grand Council Hall, ensuring that as many nobles as possible would be present to witness what he hoped would become Grace's final humiliation. Grace received word of the gathering only hours before it was scheduled to begin, informed hastily by Lucy, who had overheard servants whispering about her father's sudden arrival within the palace walls. Her stomach twisted painfully at the news, old fears resurfacing with sharp, familiar clarity. "He has come to finish what he started," Grace said quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she stood near the window of her chambers. "He will not rest until he has stripped away whatever small dignity I have managed to rebuild since leaving his household." Lucy reached for her hand firmly, her expression fierce with determination. "Then we shall face him together," she said. "You are not the same frightened woman who left Hale Manor those months ago, Grace. Remember that." Grace nodded slowly, drawing what courage she could from her friend's unwavering support, though the fear gripping her chest refused to fully loosen its hold as she made her way toward the Grand Council Hall later that afternoon. The hall itself was already crowded by the time she arrived. Nobles and council members gathered along both sides of the long chamber, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. At the front of the room, standing beside Lord Grant with visible satisfaction, stood her father, his posture rigid with the same cold authority Grace remembered so vividly from the morning he had cast her out. "You dare show your face within these walls," Lord Hale declared loudly the moment Grace entered, his voice carrying easily across the silent chamber. "A woman cast out for her failures now parades herself before the King's own council, as though her circumstances have somehow changed, simply because she has managed to charm her way into royal favor." Grace felt her chest tighten painfully beneath the weight of every eye now fixed upon her, yet she forced herself to remain standing tall, refusing to let old fears collapse her resolve entirely. "I did not choose to parade myself anywhere," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I was invited here by the King himself, a fact you seem determined to ignore in favor of continuing the same cruelty you displayed the day you cast me from our family home." "Cruelty," her father scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "I showed you mercy by allowing you to leave quietly, rather than exposing the full truth of your failures publicly. A barren woman brings nothing but shame to any household foolish enough to shelter her, and now you seek to bring that same shame upon the crown itself." Murmurs rippled through the gathered nobles, several exchanging knowing glances with Lord Grant, who watched the confrontation unfold with barely concealed satisfaction. Grace felt tears threatening to rise, old wounds reopening beneath her father's cruel words, yet she refused to let herself crumble before the very man who had once discarded her without hesitation. Before she could formulate a response, the heavy doors at the rear of the chamber burst open with sudden, thunderous force, startling the entire assembly into stunned silence. King Alden strode through the broken doorway, his expression carrying an intensity that immediately silenced every whispered conversation throughout the hall. "Enough," Alden's voice thundered through the chamber, carrying an authority that left no room for further debate. I will not stand by while my counsel permits this woman to be humiliated within these walls, based on nothing more than cruel rumor, and a father's own failure to protect his daughter when she needed him most. Lord Hale's confident expression faltered slightly beneath the king's furious gaze, though he attempted to maintain his composure. Your Majesty, he said carefully, surely you understand the concerns regarding a woman of her reputation standing so close to the crown. Her reputation, Alden interrupted sharply, was built entirely upon lies spread to protect the pride of those too weak to admit their own failures. I have witnessed her strength, her kindness, and her unwavering integrity firsthand, qualities far more valuable to this kingdom than any inherited title or empty tradition regarding a woman's worth being measured solely by her ability to bear children. He crossed the chamber quickly, coming to stand directly beside Grace, taking her hand firmly within his own, as he turned to address the stunned assembly gathered throughout the hall. Let there be no further confusion regarding her place within this court, Alden declared, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent chamber. She is my queen. Any among you who continue to question her worth, question my judgment as your king, and I promise you, such doubts will not be tolerated within these walls any longer. The chamber fell into stunned silence, nobles exchanging shocked glances as the full weight of Alden's declaration settled over the assembly. Lord Grant's expression twisted with barely concealed fury, though he wisely chose to remain silent beneath the king's furious gaze. Lord Hale, meanwhile, stood frozen, his earlier confidence completely shattered beneath the unwavering conviction reflected clearly in Alden's eyes. Grace felt tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, though this time they carried relief rather than fear, gratitude rather than shame. She looked toward Alden, overwhelmed by the fierce protection reflected so clearly in his expression, and for the first time since entering the Grand Hall, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps her long battle against cruel judgment was finally nearing its end. Yet even as Alden's declaration echoed powerfully throughout the chamber, silencing the immediate opposition surrounding her, Grace understood that deeper truths still remained buried beneath the surface. Truths that would soon reveal exactly how the cruel rumors surrounding her past had first begun, and who truly bore responsibility for the pain she had endured for far too long. In the days following the confrontation within the Grand Council Hall, Alden ordered a full and thorough investigation into the origins of the rumors that had once labeled Grace as Barren, determined to uncover the truth behind the cruel gossip that had cost her so much pain and humiliation. He entrusted the matter to Dr. Palmer, the palace physician, a man known throughout the capital for his careful diligence and unwavering honesty. Dr. Palmer began his investigation by reviewing whatever records remained from Grace's marriage to Henry Whitmore, eventually traveling personally to the small eastern village where Henry's family still resided, seeking answers directly from those who had known the couple during their brief years together. What he discovered surprised even Grace herself when the findings were eventually presented before the King's Council several days later. Standing before the same assembly that had once condemned her so harshly, Dr. Palmer addressed the gathered nobles with calm, measured authority. My investigation has revealed troubling information regarding the true circumstances surrounding Grace's marriage, he announced, unrolling a set of carefully documented findings before the assembled council. Contrary to the rumors long circulated regarding her inability to bear children, medical records obtained from physicians who once treated Henry Whitmore reveal that he suffered from a serious illness in the years before his death, one that made fatherhood exceedingly unlikely regardless of any woman he might have married. Murmurs spread quickly through the chamber as Dr. Palmer continued, explaining that Henry's own family, aware of his condition, had chosen to protect their household's reputation by allowing rumors to circulate blaming Grace entirely for the couple's lack of children, rather than risk exposing the truth of Henry's own illness to the wider public. She was never the cause of any perceived failure within that marriage, Dr. Palmer stated firmly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. The lie was constructed deliberately, and unfortunately, believed without question, by those too eager to place blame upon a woman, rather than question the reputation of a respected family name. Grace stood near the front of the chamber as the findings were revealed, overwhelmed by a rush of emotions she had not expected to feel. Vindication mixed painfully with old grief, relief tangled together with quiet anger at the years of unnecessary suffering she had endured, due to a lie constructed entirely without her knowledge or consent. Lord Hale, seated near the back of the assembly, visibly paled as Dr. Palmer's findings were read aloud, understanding immediately the implications of the revelation now made public before the entire court. He had cast out his own daughter, discarded her without mercy, based entirely upon a falsehood he had never bothered to properly investigate before condemning her so harshly. "Your Majesty," Lord Hale stammered, rising from his seat with clear discomfort, "surely this new information changes nothing regarding the appropriateness of—" "It changes everything," Alden interrupted sharply, his voice carrying unmistakable authority throughout the chamber. "Your own daughter suffered years of unwarranted shame and rejection, due to a lie you never bothered to question, choosing instead to prioritize convenience over loyalty to your own blood. That failure belongs entirely to you, Lord Hale, not to Grace, who bears no responsibility whatsoever for circumstances entirely beyond her control." The chamber fell into heavy silence, many nobles who had previously supported Lord Grant's opposition, now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly reconsidering their earlier judgments in light of the damning revelation. Lord Grant himself remained conspicuously silent, his earlier confidence entirely dissolved beneath the weight of truth now exposed before the entire court. Grace stepped forward slowly, addressing her father directly, for the first time since her humiliating departure from Hale Manor months earlier. "You never once asked me the truth," she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly throughout the silent chamber. "You believed the easiest explanation, the one that placed blame conveniently upon my shoulders rather than questioning whether the rumors themselves held any merit. That choice cost me years of pain I did not deserve, pain you allowed simply because addressing the truth required more effort than accepting convenient lies." Lord Hale said nothing in response, his expression a mixture of shame and quiet devastation, as the full weight of his failure settled visibly upon him. Several nobles who had once whispered cruelly about Grace's reputation now shifted their gazes away from him entirely, clearly recognizing the depth of his failure as a father. Alden stepped forward, placing a gentle hand upon Grace's shoulder, offering quiet support as she faced the man who had once discarded her so easily. "This council has heard the truth," Alden announced firmly, addressing the assembled nobles directly. "Let it be known throughout this kingdom that Grace's worth was never diminished by false accusations, nor will it ever be measured by outdated expectations regarding a woman's ability to bear children. Her strength, her integrity, and her compassion have proven far more valuable to this crown than any inherited bloodline or empty tradition ever could." As the council slowly began to disperse following the dramatic revelation, Grace felt a profound weight finally lifting from her shoulders, years of accumulated shame and self-doubt beginning to dissolve beneath the undeniable truth now exposed before the entire kingdom. For the first time since Henry's passing, she allowed herself to fully release the guilt she had carried for so long, understanding at last that she had never been the cause of anything she had been blamed for. Lord Grant, recognizing that his opposition had thoroughly collapsed beneath the weight of undeniable truth, quietly withdrew from the chamber, understanding that any further attempts to challenge Grace's position within the court would only further damage his own standing among the nobility. Lord Hale, meanwhile, remained standing alone near the back of the hall long after the other nobles had departed, finally confronting the full consequences of choices he could never fully undo. Grace did not linger to witness her father's quiet reckoning, choosing instead to walk beside Alden as they exited the grand hall together, her hand held firmly within his own. Whatever pain the past had caused her, whatever cruel judgments she had endured, she understood now that the truth had finally set her free from the weight she had carried for far too long. The weeks following the revelation before the council passed in a blur of preparation, as the palace slowly transformed itself in anticipation of a royal announcement that would soon be shared with the entire kingdom. Alden had made his intentions clear from the very beginning, refusing to delay any longer in declaring Grace as his intended queen, determined that the ceremony itself would serve as a clear message to the entire realm regarding the values he wished his reign to represent. Grace, though grateful for the outcome of the council's investigation, found herself still adjusting slowly to her new position within the palace walls. The whispered judgments that had once followed her through every corridor had largely faded, replaced instead by quiet curiosity and, increasingly, genuine respect from those who had witnessed her quiet strength throughout the difficult weeks of scrutiny. Sir Edwin, who had once approached her arrival with cautious uncertainty, found himself among her most steadfast supporters as preparations for the coronation ceremony continued. He visited her privately one afternoon, offering a rare, genuine smile as he delivered updates regarding the ceremony's arrangements. "The kingdom has responded far more favorably than Lord Grant ever anticipated," Edwin informed her, settling into a chair near the window of her chambers. "Word of your true story has spread throughout the capital, and many among the common people have found inspiration in your strength, rather than judgment in your past circumstances. It seems truth, once properly revealed, carries far more power than any rumor ever could." Grace felt a small, grateful smile cross her face at his words, though a flicker of nervousness remained beneath her growing confidence. "I only hope I can live up to whatever expectations now rest upon me," she admitted quietly. "Becoming queen was never something I imagined for myself, especially after everything that came before." Edwin studied her carefully for a moment before responding. "Your Majesty," he said, using her new title with clear sincerity. "Expectations placed upon rulers often prove far less important than the character they carry into their responsibilities. From what I have witnessed these past weeks, you carry compassion, resilience, and honesty in equal measure. Those qualities alone will serve this kingdom far better than any inherited bloodline ever could." As the day of the coronation finally arrived, Grace stood within the private chambers reserved for her preparation, staring at her own reflection in the tall mirror positioned near the window. She wore a gown of deep blue silk, elegant yet simple, chosen deliberately to reflect her own quiet strength, rather than excessive extravagance. Lucy stood beside her, carefully adjusting the final details of her appearance, tears of joy glistening in her eyes as she studied her friend's transformation. "Do you remember," Lucy said softly, "the night we left Hale Manor together, uncertain of what awaited us beyond those gates? I could never have imagined this moment, standing here now, preparing to watch you become queen of this entire kingdom." Grace reached for her friend's hand, squeezing it gently with quiet gratitude. "I could not have survived those difficult months without you beside me, Lucy," she said sincerely. "Whatever comes next, I want you to know that your loyalty will never be forgotten, nor will it ever go unrewarded." As the ceremony began, Grace walked slowly through the grand hall, the same chamber where she had once faced her father's cruel accusations, now transformed entirely with banners and flowers, celebrating a very different occasion. Nobles who had once whispered judgment now stood respectfully as she passed, many offering genuine smiles of support as she made her way toward the raised platform, where Alden waited. Lord Hale, humbled significantly by the revelations exposed weeks earlier, stood quietly among the assembled nobility, his influence within the court considerably diminished following his public failure. He watched silently as his daughter approached the throne, the same daughter he had once discarded without hesitation, now preparing to become queen of the very kingdom he had hoped to protect through cruel convenience rather than loyalty. As Grace reached the platform, Alden took her hands gently within his own, addressing the assembled court with quiet, unwavering conviction. "Today, we crown a queen, not for the bloodline she carries, nor for any title inherited through birth," he announced, his voice carrying clearly throughout the silent hall. "We crown her for the strength she has shown throughout every hardship placed before her, for the compassion she extends even to those who have wronged her, and for the unwavering integrity that has guided her through circumstances that would have broken lesser souls entirely." The crown was placed gently upon Grace's head, and as the assembled nobles began to applaud, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over her, the culmination of a journey that had begun months earlier, with nothing but heartbreak and uncertainty. She looked toward Alden, gratitude and love reflected clearly in her expression, understanding fully now that the pain of her past had ultimately led her toward a future she could never have imagined possible. In the months that followed, Grace embraced her new role with quiet dedication, using her position to advocate for widows and women throughout the kingdom who had faced similar judgment and cruelty regarding matters entirely beyond their control. She established support systems for women cast aside by their families, ensuring that others would never have to endure the same isolation she once faced, walking away from Hale Manor with nothing but a small bag and a single loyal friend by her side. Lord Hale eventually retreated from public life entirely, his influence within the court permanently diminished, forced finally to confront the consequences of choices he could never undo. Grace, despite everything he had put her through, chose not to pursue further punishment against him. understanding that true strength required moving forward, rather than dwelling upon past cruelty. Lucy remained close beside Grace throughout the following years, her loyalty rewarded with a permanent position within the palace, serving as one of the Queen's most trusted advisors and closest friends. The bond forged between them during their most difficult months together remained unbroken, a testament to the quiet strength of true friendship, built through shared hardship. As for Grace and Alden, their partnership grew stronger with each passing year, built not upon the fragile foundation of inherited titles or political convenience, but upon genuine respect, unwavering support, and the quiet understanding that true worth could never be measured by circumstances beyond one's control. Together, they ruled with compassion and fairness, transforming a kingdom once governed by rigid tradition into one that valued character above bloodline, strength above convenience, and truth above cruel, convenient lies. The widow once cast out for her perceived failures had risen to become a queen, remembered not for the shame once placed upon her, but for the quiet resilience that carried her through every hardship toward a future brighter than she had ever dared to imagine.